love, loyalty, and lethal lies. Alessandra Romano had never believed in love, not in their world. But when she found herself backed into a marriage she did not choose, when her father's enemies came to collect, she realized something dangerous. There was only one man who could protect her. And he was the man she had once destroyed. He looked at her unreadable. Then slowly he smiled. "You need a husband," he murmured. "And lucky for you, I'm available." Chapter 1. The Reluctant Bride's Dilemma. The chill of the Roman November air seeped through the ancient stones of the Palazzo Romano, mirroring the cold dread that had settled in Alessandra's heart. Outside, the city thrummed with life, the distant sirens, the murmur of voices, the rumble of Vespas, but within these walls, a suffocating silence reigned. She stood by the tall, arched window, her fingers tracing the delicate, frost-like patterns the condensation had formed on the glass. The view, usually a breathtaking panorama of terracotta rooftops and the distant dome of St. Peter's, was lost on her. Her world had narrowed, constricted, become a gilded cage. Alessandra Romano, at 58, was a woman who had lived a life of privilege, yet one punctuated by a quiet, pervasive sorrow. Her husband, Marco, had died 5 years prior, a sudden heart attack, they said, though whispers of a more sinister end had always circulated within the family. Marco, a powerful man in his own right, had shielded her from the darker realities of their world, the famiglia, the intricate web of alliances and obligations that governed their lives. She had been content, or at least, she had convinced herself she was. Contentment was a safer harbor than happiness, especially in their world. Now, that carefully constructed world was crumbling. Her father, Don Lorenzo Romano, a man whose presence filled a room even when he was silent, had summoned her. The summons itself was not unusual. Family meetings were a regular occurrence. But the tone of his voice, the grim set of his jaw, the way his eyes, usually sharp and calculating, had seemed to flicker with, was it fear? That was what had truly unnerved her. He had delivered the news with the bluntness that was his trademark. "The Moretti family is calling in their debts, Alessandra." The Morettis. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. Rivals for generations, their feud with the Romanos was legendary, a bloody tapestry woven with betrayal and vengeance. The debts, of course, were not merely financial. They were debts of blood, of honor, of ancient grievances that festered like open wounds. "What debts, Papa?" she had asked, her voice surprisingly steady, even to her own ears. Lorenzo had looked at her then, a long, assessing look that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. "Debts your husband incurred. Debts he failed to settle." The implication was clear. Marco's death had not been a random act of fate. It had been a consequence. And now, the consequences were coming home to roost. The solution, as Lorenzo presented it, was equally blunt. Marriage. To a Moretti. Specifically, to Dante Moretti, the current head of the family, a man she hadn't seen in over 30 years, a man who occupied a dark, shadowed corner of her memory. Dante Moretti. The name conjured images of a young man, impossibly handsome, with eyes that burned with an intensity that both frightened and fascinated her. A young man she had known, briefly, intensely, before their families had torn them apart. A young man she had betrayed. The memory of that betrayal, a youthful indiscretion fueled by fear and a desperate desire to escape the suffocating constraints of her life, still had the power to make her stomach clench with shame. She had been foolish, naive, believing she could outwit the intricate machinations of their world. She had paid the price, and so had he. Now, decades later, that past was rising up to engulf her. Marriage to Dante Moretti was not a solution, it was a punishment. A gilded cage with a far more dangerous jailer. He agreed? Alessandra had whispered, the question barely audible. Lorenzo gave a curt nod. He has his reasons. Of course he did. Revenge, most likely. A chance to finally settle the score, to humiliate the Romanos, to claim his pound of flesh. And she was to be the sacrificial lamb. She turned away from the window, her reflection staring back at her, a woman with silver threading through her dark hair, lines etched around her eyes, a lingering sadness in her expression. But there was also a flicker of defiance, a spark of the woman she had once been, the woman who had dared to dream of a different life. A soft knock on the door broke the silence. It was Sophia, her longtime housekeeper and confidant, a woman who had been with the family for decades, a silent witness to all their triumphs and tragedies. "Signora," Sophia said, her voice laced with concern, "your father is waiting." Alessandra took a deep breath, steeling herself. She would not crumble. She would not give them the satisfaction. She was a Romano, and even in the face of this impossible situation, she would find a way to survive. She would face Dante Moretti, face her past, and somehow find a way to navigate this treacherous new reality. The thought of seeing him again, after all these years, sent a shiver down her spine, a mixture of fear and something else. Something she couldn't quite name, something that felt dangerously close to anticipation. It was this flicker, this unknown, that made her hand clench. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked towards the door, towards her fate, towards the man she had once destroyed and who now held her future in his hands. The meeting would likely be a disaster, but it was one she was now morbidly curious about. She had to see the fire in his eyes again, if only to confirm her memory had been playing. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past return. The library, Lorenzo's domain, was a room that exuded power and history. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled with leather-bound volumes, lined the walls. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, polished wood, and the faint aroma of Lorenzo's favorite Cuban cigars. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like the secrets that permeated the room. Lorenzo sat behind his massive, antique desk, a formidable figure even in his advancing years. His silver hair was slicked back, his dark eyes sharp and piercing, his jaw set in a grim line. He was not alone. Standing by the window, a silhouette against the fading light, was a man Alessandra recognized instantly, despite the decades that had passed. Dante Moretti. He was taller than she remembered, broader in the shoulders, his presence filling the space in a way that was both commanding and subtly threatening. His hair, once a riot of dark curls, was now neatly trimmed, streaked with silver at the temples, giving him a distinguished, almost regal air. He was dressed impeccably in a dark suit that spoke of understated elegance and power. But it was his eyes that held her captive. The same intense, dark eyes that had haunted her dreams for years, now fixed on her with an unreadable expression. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Alessandra felt a tremor run through her, a mixture of fear and a strange, unsettling awareness of him. She had prepared herself for this meeting, rehearsed her lines, steeled her resolve. But all her carefully constructed defenses seemed to crumble in the face of his presence. Lorenzo broke the silence, his voice gruff. "Alessandra, you know why you're here." It wasn't a question. She nodded, her gaze still locked with Dante's. "Yes, Papa. Dante has graciously agreed to our proposal." Lorenzo's tone suggested that graciously was a considerable understatement. "A marriage between you two will settle the debts, restore the balance, ensure peace between our families." Peace. The words sounded hollow, almost absurd, given the history between them, the blood that had been spilled, the betrayals that had been committed. Dante finally spoke, his voice a low, resonant rumble that sent a shiver down Alessandra's spine. "Peace is a fragile thing, Lorenzo. Easily broken." His gaze shifted to Alessandra, and she felt a jolt, as if an electric current had passed between them. Especially when built on a foundation of lies. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Alessandra felt her cheeks flush, the old shame rising up to choke her. She had lied, all those years ago. Lied to protect herself, lied to escape, lied to betray him. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her voice surprisingly steady. "I did what I thought was necessary." A flicker of something amusement?
Contempt?
Crossed his face. Necessary for whom, Alessandra? Yourself? For my family, she retorted, her pride flaring. She would not let him see her weakness, her regret. He gave a slow, deliberate nod.
Ah, yes.
Family. The sacred bond that justifies all sins. His voice was laced with a subtle sarcasm that made her bristle. Lorenzo cleared his throat, a warning rumble. This is not the time for recriminations. The past is the past. We are here to discuss the future. The future, Dante repeated, his gaze still fixed on Alessandra. A future where you will be my wife. The words were spoken softly, yet they carried the weight of a decree, a sentence. Alessandra felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This was not a marriage, it was a takeover, a subjugation. She forced herself to speak, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. And what do you expect from this marriage, Dante? He finally turned away from the window, moving towards her with a slow, deliberate grace that made her heart pound against her ribs. He stopped mere inches from her, close enough for her to feel the warmth of his body, to catch the faint scent of his cologne, a subtle blend of citrus and spice that stirred something deep within her. He looked down at her, his dark eyes searching hers. Loyalty, he said softly. Obedience. And perhaps eventually trust. The last word was spoken with a hint of something she couldn't quite decipher, a flicker of vulnerability, perhaps, or maybe just a cruel mockery of the trust she had shattered so long ago. Trust is earned, Dante, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He smiled then, a slow, chilling smile that didn't reach his eyes. Indeed, it is, Alessandra. And you have a great deal of earning to do. He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against her cheek, a touch that was both possessive and unsettling. She flinched, but didn't pull away. She couldn't. She was trapped, bound by duty, by obligation, by the weight of her family's past. We will be married next week, he said, his voice a low murmur that only she could hear. Be ready. He stepped back, the spell broken. The room seemed to breathe again. Lorenzo, who had been watching the exchange with a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension, nodded. It is settled, then, he said, his voice regaining its usual authority. The arrangements will be made. Alessandra felt a surge of anger, of resentment, towards her father, towards Dante, towards the entire system that had trapped her in this gilded cage. But she knew she had no choice. She was a pawn in their game, a piece to be moved and manipulated. As she left the library, Dante's eyes followed her. There was the faintest suggestion he wanted her to run, to prove him right that she was still the same fearful, untrustworthy girl he had once known. But she wouldn't. She would play her part, fulfill her duty, and somehow find a way to survive this marriage, this alliance, this twisted game of power and revenge.
She just didn't know how.
And the unknown was far more terrifying than any concrete plan. It was this feeling she knew he reveled in. The power he seemed to have, knowing her fear. Chapter 3. A bargain struck in darkness. The days that followed were a blur of activity, a whirlwind of preparations that felt both surreal and suffocating. Alessandra moved through it all like a ghost, a silent observer in her own life. Dresses were fitted, invitations were sent, arrangements were made, all without her active participation. She was a puppet, her strings pulled by forces beyond her control. She hadn't spoken to Dante since that night in the library, but his presence was a constant, looming shadow. She felt his eyes on her, even when he wasn't there. She heard his voice in her dreams, a low, seductive murmur that both terrified and intrigued her. One evening, a few days before the wedding, she found herself alone in the Palazzo Gardens. The air was crisp and cool, the scent of jasmine and roses heavy in the night. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the world outside, the world she was about to be even further removed from. She sat on a stone bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to make sense of the chaos that had engulfed her life. She felt a profound sense of loneliness, a yearning for something she couldn't quite name. Connection, perhaps. Understanding. Or Maybe just a moment of peace. A sound behind her made her turn. Dante stood there, silhouetted against the moonlight, his face obscured by shadow. He moved towards her with that same slow, deliberate grace, his footsteps silent on the gravel path. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. She shook her head, unable to speak. The sight of him, so close, so real, unnerved her. He sat down beside her on the bench, leaving a deliberate space between them, yet his presence still felt overwhelming. "You're afraid," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. She didn't deny it. "Wouldn't you be?" He gave a slight shrug. "Fear is a natural response. It's what you do with it that matters." "And what do you do with it, Dante?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to face her, his eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "I use it. I control it. I make it my weapon." She looked away, unable to hold his gaze. "I'm not like you." "No," he agreed. "You're not.
But you could be."
She felt a flicker of something defiance, perhaps, or maybe just a desperate desire to prove him wrong. "I don't want to be like you." He smiled then, a slow, knowing smile that made her heart skip a beat. "We don't always get what we want, Alessandra. Especially in our world." He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against her hand, a touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. She flinched, but didn't pull away. "This marriage, it's not just about settling debts, is it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear.
"No, cara. It's about much more than that."
"What is it about, then?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze searching hers. "It's about power," he said softly. "It's about control. It's about redemption." The last word was spoken with a hint of something she couldn't quite decipher, a flicker of vulnerability, perhaps, or maybe just a cruel mockery of the redemption she had sought so long ago. "And what role do I play in this redemption?" she asked, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. He smiled again, that same slow, chilling smile. "You, Alessandra, are the key." He stood up, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. "Don't run from this, Alessandra. Don't try to fight it. Embrace it. And maybe, just maybe, we can both find what we're looking for." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the darkness, her mind reeling, her heart pounding. His words echoed in her ears, a mixture of threat and promise, of fear and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. The bargain, unspoken until now, was clear. He wouldn't break her if she didn't try to run. But she knew, with a growing certainty, that not breaking her didn't equate to kindness. It was simply a different form of control. The question was, could she survive it? Or would she become another casualty of their family's endless war? She was no longer sure. Chapter 4. Whispers of Betrayal and Desire. The wedding day dawned gray and overcast, the sky mirroring the turmoil in Alessandra's heart. She stood before the mirror in her elaborate wedding gown, a masterpiece of silk and lace, feeling like a stranger in her own skin. The dress, chosen by Lorenzo's wife, Isabella, was beautiful, undeniably so, but it felt like a costume, a disguise. Sophia, her ever-present confidante, fussed over the final details, her hands trembling slightly. "You look beautiful, Signora," she said, her voice laced with a mixture of pride and sadness. Alessandra forced a smile. "Thank you, Sophia." She knew Sophia disapproved of the marriage, of the entire situation. She had seen the fear in her eyes, the unspoken concern. But Sophia, like Alessandra, was bound by loyalty, by duty. She would never openly question the decisions of the famiglia. As she looked at her reflection, Alessandra couldn't help but think of the young woman she had once been, the girl who had dreamed of a different life, a life filled with love and laughter, not this cold, calculated union. That girl was long gone, buried beneath layers of regret and resignation. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Isabella, Lorenzo's second wife, a woman Alessandra had never truly connected with. Isabella was beautiful, elegant, and impeccably groomed, but there was a coldness about her, a distance that kept Alessandra at arm's length. "It's time," Isabella said, her voice devoid of emotion. Alessandra nodded, taking a deep breath. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching herself from afar, a spectator in her own life. The ceremony was held in the family chapel, a small, ornate space filled with the scent of incense and lilies. The guests, a mix of family members and close associates, were a sea of dark suits and elegant dresses. Alessandra felt their eyes on her, curious, judging, assessing. She walked down the aisle on Lorenzo's arm, her gaze fixed on the altar, where Dante awaited her. He looked magnificent in his tailored suit, his dark eyes intense and unreadable. He exuded power and confidence, a stark contrast to the turmoil she felt inside. The ceremony itself was a blur, a series of rituals and vows that felt empty and meaningless. Alessandra spoke the words, made the promises, but her heart wasn't in it. She felt like an actress playing a role, reciting lines she didn't believe. When Dante slipped the heavy gold ring onto her finger, a symbol of their union, their bondage, she felt a shiver run down her spine. It was done. She was now Alessandra Moretti, wife of Dante Moretti, the man she had once betrayed, the man who now held her fate in his hands. The reception was held in the grand ballroom of the Palazzo, a lavish affair with champagne flowing freely and music filling the air. Alessandra moved through the crowd, smiling, greeting guests, playing the part of the happy bride. But inside, she felt numb, empty. Dante was the perfect host, charming and attentive, his hand resting possessively on her waist, a constant reminder of her new status. She felt his gaze on her, watching her every move, assessing her every reaction. During a brief lull in the festivities, Dante led her onto the dance floor. As they swayed to the music, he leaned down, his breath warm against her ear. "You're playing your part well, Alessandra," he murmured. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "Is that all this is to you, Dante? A performance?" He smiled, a slow, enigmatic smile. "For now, yes. But things can change. And what will it take for things to change?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He tightened his grip on her waist, pulling her closer. "Time," he said softly. "And perhaps a little bit of trust." The word hung between them, a challenge, a taunt. Alessandra felt a flicker of anger, of defiance. She would not let him break her. She would not let him see her weakness. "Don't expect too much, Dante," she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "I'm not the naive girl you once knew." His smile widened. "I know, Cara. That's what makes this so interesting." As the evening wore on, Alessandra began to notice the subtle undercurrents, the whispers and glances, the veiled conversations. She realized that this wedding, this alliance, was not just about her and Dante. It was about power, about shifting alliances, about a delicate balance that could be shattered at any moment. She heard whispers of a rival family, the Rossi, growing in strength, challenging the established order. And within those whispers a name she dreaded to think about, Marco. Her husband, her past, the true cause of this all. She felt a growing sense of unease, a premonition that this marriage, this fragile peace, was built on a foundation of sand, and that the storm was coming. The whispers grew to a crescendo when she heard a fragment of conversation near a shadowed alcove. Two men, voices low, speaking of betrayals and old scores, a new threat, and her name was mentioned. It was a clear confirmation of her fear, that the wedding hadn't just tied her to Dante, it tied her to a future she couldn't control. Chapter 5. The Lion's Den Beckons. The following morning, Alessandra awoke in a new room, in a new home, Dante's villa, a sprawling estate overlooking the city. The villa was magnificent, a testament to the Moretti family's wealth and power, but it felt cold, impersonal, a far cry from the familiar comfort of the Palazzo Romano. She was alone. Dante had left early, a note on the bedside table informing her that he had business to attend to. The note was brief, impersonal, a stark reminder of the nature of their relationship. She was his wife in name only, a pawn in his game. She wandered through the vast, silent rooms, feeling like an intruder. The decor was opulent, filled with antiques and artwork, but it lacked warmth, personality. It was a showpiece, not a home. She found a small, sunny breakfast room overlooking a manicured garden. A place setting had been laid out for her, complete with a silver coffee pot and a selection of pastries. She sat down but had little appetite. The silence of the villa was oppressive, broken only by the occasional distant sound of a car or a bird singing. She felt isolated, cut off from everything she knew and loved. As she sipped her coffee, a woman entered the room. She was tall and slender, with sharp features and cold, assessing eyes. She was dressed impeccably in a dark suit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Signora Moretti," she said, her voice crisp and formal. "I am Isabella Rossi, Signor Moretti's assistant." The name Rossi struck a chord, a discordant note of unease. The Rossi family. The rivals. The whispers from the wedding reception came flooding back. This Isabella was not Lorenzo's wife. Alessandra forced herself to remain calm, to maintain her composure. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Isabella." Isabella gave a curt nod. "Signor Moretti has instructed me to ensure you are comfortable and to familiarize you with the household." "Thank you," Alessandra said, her voice tight with suppressed suspicion. Isabella proceeded to give her a tour of the villa, pointing out the various rooms, the staff quarters, the security systems. Her manner was efficient, impersonal, her gaze constantly assessing, evaluating. Alessandra felt like a specimen under a microscope, scrutinized and judged. As they walked, Alessandra tried to glean some information from Isabella to understand her role in Dante's life, her connection to the Rossi family. But Isabella was guarded, revealing nothing. "How long have you worked for Signor Moretti?" Alessandra asked, trying to sound casual. "Many years," Isabella replied, her voice giving nothing away. "And your family, are they also involved in the business?" Alessandra pressed, her heart pounding. Isabella stopped, her eyes narrowing. "My family's affairs are of no concern to you, Signora Moretti." The rebuke was sharp, a clear warning. Alessandra realized she had overstepped, pushed too far. She had to be careful. She was walking on eggshells, surrounded by secrets and hidden agendas. Later that afternoon, Dante returned. He found her in the library, a smaller, more intimate space than Lorenzo's, but still filled with books and the scent of old leather. He greeted her with a kiss on the cheek, a formal gesture that felt hollow and meaningless. "Did Isabella make you feel welcome?" he asked, his voice neutral. "She was thorough," Alessandra replied, choosing her words carefully. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Isabella is very efficient. She knows everything that goes on in this house. And everything that goes on outside of it, I imagine," Alessandra said, her voice laced with a hint of sarcasm. He raised an eyebrow. "You're learning quickly, Alessandra." "I have to," she retorted. "I'm surrounded by enemies." He laughed, a low, rumbling sound. "Not enemies, Cara. Just competitors." "And what am I, Dante? A competitor? An enemy? Or just a prize?" He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "You are my wife," he said softly, "and that makes you valuable." He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, a touch that sent a shiver down her spine. She flinched, but didn't pull away. "Don't be afraid, Alessandra," he murmured. "I won't hurt you, unless you give me reason to." The threat was veiled, subtle, but it was there, hanging in the air between them. Alessandra felt a surge of anger, of defiance. "I'm not afraid of you, Dante," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He smiled again, that same slow, chilling smile.
"Good.
Because fear is a weakness. And we can't afford weakness in our world." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the library, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She was in the lion's den now, surrounded by predators. She had to be smart, she had to be careful, and she had to find a way to survive. But as she looked around at the opulence, at the cold beauty of her new prison, she wondered if survival was even possible, or if she was already doomed. The feeling of unease was amplified by Isabella Rossi's presence. It was more than a rivalry. Alessandra was sure of it. Chapter 6. Masks of Civility and Deceit. Life at the Moretti Villa settled into a strange, uneasy routine. Alessandra spent her days exploring the vast house and gardens, trying to find some semblance of normalcy in her new, unfamiliar surroundings. She had little contact with Dante, who was often absent, consumed by the demands of his business. When he was home, he was polite, distant, treating her more like a guest than a wife. Isabella Rossi was a constant presence, her sharp eyes watching Alessandra's every move, her demeanor cold and unwelcoming. Alessandra tried to avoid her as much as possible, but it was difficult in the confines of the villa. She felt like a prisoner, monitored and controlled. She tried to keep busy, to occupy her mind. She read, she walked, she even attempted to learn Italian, a language she had always neglected. But nothing seemed to fill the void, the emptiness she felt inside. She missed her old life, her friends, her familiar routines. She missed the comfort of the Palazzo Romano, even with its own set of secrets and tensions. One afternoon, she found herself in the villa's music room. A grand piano sat in the corner, gleaming in the sunlight. Alessandra had always loved music, finding solace in its beauty and power. She sat down at the piano, her fingers hesitantly touching the keys. She began to play, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. The music flowed through her, a release for the pent-up emotions she had been suppressing. She played for hours, losing herself in the melodies, forgetting, for a brief time, the reality of her situation. As she played the final notes of a Chopin nocturne, she heard a sound behind her. She turned to see Dante standing in the doorway, watching her. He had changed from earlier. Now less formal, a button-down shirt was opened just enough to see a hint of his chest. He walked towards her, his eyes fixed on hers. "I didn't know you played," he said, his voice softer than usual. She shrugged, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "It's been a while." He sat down beside her on the piano bench, close enough for her to feel the warmth of his body. "Play something else," he said. She hesitated, feeling strangely self-conscious under his gaze. But she complied, choosing a simple, melancholic melody. As she played, she felt his eyes on her, a silent, intense scrutiny that made her heart pound. When she finished, he didn't speak for a moment. Then, he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against her hair, tucking a stray strand behind her ear. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through her. "You have a gift, Alessandra," he said softly. "A beauty that shines through, even in the darkness." She looked away, unable to hold his gaze. His words, his touch, unnerved her. They felt too intimate, too genuine. She didn't know how to reconcile this side of him with the cold, calculating man she had married. "Don't try to flatter me, Dante," she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "I know what this is. I know what I am to you." He smiled, a slow, enigmatic smile. "Do you, Alessandra? I wonder." He stood up, his shadow falling over her. "Dinner will be served soon. Don't be late." He left the room, leaving her alone with her confusion and a growing sense of unease. His words, his actions, were contradictory, sending mixed signals. She didn't know what to believe, what to trust. Dinner that evening was a strained affair. Dante was quiet, preoccupied, his mind clearly elsewhere. Isabella Rossi was present, as always, her sharp eyes darting between Alessandra and Dante, observing their every interaction. Alessandra tried to make conversation, but it was difficult. Dante answered in monosyllables, his attention focused on the contents of his plate. Isabella remained silent, her expression unreadable. As the meal progressed, Alessandra noticed a subtle tension between Dante and Isabella, a silent exchange of glances, a veiled undercurrent of something she couldn't quite decipher. She felt like an outsider, excluded from a conversation she didn't understand. After dinner, Dante excused himself, claiming he had work to do. Alessandra was left alone with Isabella. Signora Moretti, Isabella said, her voice crisp and formal. I need to discuss a few matters with you regarding the household. Alessandra braced herself, anticipating another round of scrutiny and control. But Isabella's words surprised her. Signor Moretti has instructed me to inform you that you will be attending a gathering tomorrow evening, Isabella said. It is a social event with some of our associates. Alessandra felt a knot tighten in her stomach. A social event with their associates. It sounded ominous, a veiled threat disguised as civility. What kind of gathering? Alessandra asked, trying to sound calm. Isabella's lips tightened. It is a business meeting with some important people. Alessandra knew what that meant. It was a test, a way for Dante to gauge her loyalty, her ability to play her part in his world. She was being thrown into the deep end, expected to swim with the sharks. The feeling of dread was overwhelming, and she knew, with a growing certainty, that Isabella was not simply relaying a message. She was delivering a warning. Chapter 7. Echoes of a Shattered Trust. The gathering, as Isabella had so delicately put it, was held at a lavish villa on the outskirts of Rome. The villa belonged to the Rossi family, a fact that did little to ease Alessandra's apprehension. As she stepped out of the car, she was immediately struck by the opulence of the place, the sheer display of wealth and power. The villa was even grander than Dante's, a sprawling complex of buildings and gardens, illuminated by hundreds of lights. Music and laughter drifted from the open windows, the sounds of a party in full swing. But Alessandra knew that beneath the veneer of civility, this was a gathering of wolves, a place where alliances were forged and broken, where fortunes were made and lost. Dante greeted her at the entrance, his hand resting possessively on her waist. He looked impeccable in a dark suit, his eyes sharp and alert. He leaned down, his breath warm against her ear. Remember, he murmured, you are my wife. Act accordingly. The words were a command, a reminder of her role in this charade. Alessandra nodded, her heart pounding against her ribs. She felt like a lamb being led to the slaughter. They entered the villa, and Alessandra was immediately surrounded by a sea of faces, a mix of familiar and unfamiliar figures. She recognized some of the guests from her wedding, members of the Moretti and Romano families. But there were others, faces she didn't know, men with hard eyes and calculating smiles, women draped in jewels and designer dresses. She was introduced to countless people, their names and titles a blur in her mind. She smiled. She made polite conversation. She played the part of the gracious hostess. But inside, she felt a growing sense of unease, a premonition that something was amiss. She noticed the way people looked at her, the subtle whispers, the veiled glances. She felt like an object of scrutiny, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. She saw Isabella Rossi across the room, talking to a group of men, her expression intense and focused. She caught Isabella's eye, and the woman gave her a cold, almost imperceptible nod. As the evening wore on, Alessandra began to pick up snippets of conversation, fragments of information that painted a disturbing picture. She heard whispers of a growing threat, a challenge to the established order. She heard the name Rossi mentioned repeatedly, and not always in a positive light. And there it was again, Marco's name whispered between discussions of old debts and unsettled scores. She realized that the rivalry between the Moretti and Rossi families was more complex, more dangerous, than she had initially understood. It wasn't just about business, about territory. It was about something deeper, something more personal. At one point, she found herself alone with an older man, a distant relative of Dante's, a man named Enzo. Enzo was a seasoned veteran of the Famiglia, his face etched with the lines of a life lived on the edge. You're new to this world, Signora Moretti, Enzo said, his voice low and gravelly. Alessandra nodded, feeling a flicker of hope that she might find an ally in this man. Yes, I am. Enzo looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and warning. Be careful, child. This world is full of shadows, full of secrets. Trust no one. Not even my husband? Alessandra asked, her voice barely a whisper. Enzo hesitated for a moment, his gaze searching hers. "Especially not your husband," he said softly. "Dante has a past that haunts him, a past that you should know about." Before he could elaborate, Dante appeared at her side, his hand gripping her arm, a silent warning. "Enzo," he said, his voice polite but firm. "I believe my wife is needed elsewhere." He steered Alessandra away, his grip tightening on her arm. "Don't listen to him," he said, his voice low and menacing. "He's an old fool, filled with old grievances." Alessandra looked up at him, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "What is he talking about, Dante? What past? What secrets?" Dante stopped, his eyes searching hers. He seemed to be struggling with something, a conflict raging within him. Then he sighed, his grip loosening on her arm. "It's a long story, Alessandra," he said softly. "A story that's not easy to tell." "Tell me," she pleaded. "I need to know. I need to understand." He hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded. "Not here," he said.
Not now.
"But I promise you, I will tell you everything."
Soon.
The promise hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. Alessandra didn't know whether to believe him, whether to trust him. But she knew one thing. The past, the shattered trust, the secrets, were all coming to the surface. And she was caught in the middle of it all. The evening continued, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing rapidly. She needed answers, and she was determined to get them, no matter the cost. The cost, she feared, would be the last of her naive ideas of this world. Chapter 8. The Price of Protection. The ride back to the villa was silent, filled with a tension that was almost palpable. Alessandra sat beside Dante, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the evening's events, Enzo's cryptic warning, Dante's promise. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of secrets, grasping for a lifeline. When they arrived at the villa, Dante led her to the library, the same room where he had first revealed the true nature of their marriage. He poured them both a glass of brandy, the amber liquid sloshing in the glasses. "Sit down, Alessandra," he said, his voice softer than usual. "It's time I told you the truth." She sat down on the plush sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She watched as he paced the room, his movements agitated, his expression troubled. He seemed to be struggling to find the right words, the right way to begin. "You know about the rivalry between our families," he finally said, his voice low and strained. "The Morettis and the Romanos. It's been going on for generations, a cycle of violence and betrayal." She nodded, her gaze fixed on him. "Yes, I know. But what you don't know," he continued, "is the personal nature of that rivalry. The connection between your family and mine." He stopped pacing, turning to face her. His eyes were filled with a pain, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "Your husband, Marco," he said, the name tasting like poison on his tongue. "He was not the man you thought he was." Alessandra felt a chill run down her spine. She had always suspected that Marco had secrets, that there was more to his life, to his death, than she had been told. But she had never dared to delve too deeply, afraid of what she might find. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Dante took a deep breath, as if bracing himself for what he was about to reveal. "Marco was involved with the Rossi family," he said. "He was working with them against us." Alessandra gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible." Dante shook his head. "It's true, Alessandra. I have proof. Documents, recordings, witnesses." He walked over to his desk, opening a drawer and pulling out a thick file. He handed it to her, his hand trembling slightly. "This contains everything," he said. "The evidence of Marco's betrayal." Alessandra stared at the file, her mind reeling. She didn't want to believe it, but she couldn't deny the weight of the evidence, the cold, hard facts staring back at her. She slowly opened the file, her hands shaking. She began to read, her eyes scanning the documents, the transcripts, the photographs. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. Marco had been playing a double game, working with the Rossi family to undermine the Morettis, to steal their business, their power. And then she saw it. A photograph of Marco with Isabella Rossi, their arms intertwined, their faces close, their expressions intimate. It was clear that their relationship was more than just business. It was personal. Alessandra felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She felt betrayed, violated, her entire world crumbling around her. Marco, the man she had loved, the man she had mourned, had been a liar, a traitor.
Why?
She whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Why would he do this? Dante came to stand beside her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. Power, he said softly.
Greed.
Ambition. The usual motivations. But why didn't you tell me before? She asked, her eyes searching his. Why wait until now? He sighed, his gaze turning distant. I wanted to protect you, he said. I didn't want to hurt you. And I wanted to see if you were different. Different? She repeated, her voice laced with confusion. Different from him, he clarified. Different from your family. I wanted to see if you were worthy of my trust. And am I? She pressed, feeling a desperate need for his approval, his validation. A confirmation she hadn't married one traitor to find herself with another. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions. I don't know, Alessandra, he said softly. I hope so. But trust is a fragile thing, easily broken. He took the file from her hands, closing it with a decisive snap. This marriage, he continued, it was never about love. It was about protection. Protecting you from the consequences of Marco's actions. Protecting my family from the Rossi threat. And what is the price of that protection, Dante? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He stepped closer, his gaze locking with hers. Your loyalty, he said softly. Your obedience. And perhaps eventually your heart. The words hung in the air. A contract. A bargain struck in the darkness. Alessandra felt trapped, bound by duty, by obligation, by a past she couldn't escape. But as she looked into Dante's eyes, she saw something else, a flicker of hope, a glimmer of something that might, just might, be worth fighting for. She knew that she'd been protected from the truth. Now that truth would have to be faced, and she only hoped Dante's version was the whole story. Chapter 9. Unveiling Hidden Truths. The days that followed were a blur of revelations and adjustments. Alessandra spent hours poring over the documents Dante had given her, piecing together the puzzle of Marco's betrayal, his double life, his secret alliance with the Rossi family. The more she learned, the more her image of her late husband shattered, replaced by a stranger, a man she had never truly known. She confronted Isabella Rossi, demanding answers, seeking clarification. Isabella, to her surprise, was surprisingly forthcoming, confirming the details of her affair with Marco, her involvement in his schemes. But she also revealed something new, something that added another layer of complexity to the already tangled web. Marco was not acting alone, Isabella said, her voice cold and devoid of emotion. He had backers within your own family. Alessandra felt a chill run down her spine. Betrayal within her own family? It was almost too much to bear. Who? She demanded, her voice trembling. Who was working with him? Isabella hesitated for a moment, her gaze shifting away. I cannot say, she said softly. It is dangerous to speak their names. Alessandra knew that Isabella was telling the truth, at least in part. She was protecting someone powerful, someone within the Romano family. But who?
And why?
She turned to Dante, seeking his help, his guidance. He listened patiently as she recounted her conversation with Isabella, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a dark intensity. I suspected as much, he said, his voice low and thoughtful. There has always been a faction within the Romano family that resented my father, that sought to undermine our power. But who, Dante? She pleaded. Who are they? He hesitated for a moment, his gaze searching hers. I have my suspicions, he said. But I need proof. I need to be certain before I make a move. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. Don't worry, Alessandra, he said softly. I will protect you. I will uncover the truth. And I will make them pay. His words, his touch, sent a shiver down her spine. She felt a strange mix of fear and gratitude, of apprehension, and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to trust. In the following days, Dante became increasingly preoccupied, consumed by his investigation into the Romano family's internal affairs. He spent hours on the phone, meeting with informants, poring over documents. He was like a hunter on the trail of his prey, relentless, determined. Alessandra, meanwhile, felt increasingly isolated, left to her own devices in the vast, silent villa. She tried to keep busy, to occupy her mind, but it was difficult. The weight of the secrets, the betrayals, the hidden truths pressed down on her, suffocating her. One afternoon, she decided to visit her father, Lorenzo. She hadn't seen him since the wedding, and she felt a desperate need to connect with him, to seek his counsel, his reassurance. She found him in his library, the same room where her fate had been decided, where her life had been irrevocably altered. He looked older, more frail, his usual air of authority diminished. "Alessandra," he said, his voice surprised, a flicker of something that looked like guilt crossing his face. "What brings you here?" She sat down opposite him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I need to talk to you, Papa," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "About Marco. About the Rossi family. About everything." Lorenzo sighed, his gaze turning distant. "I know," he said softly. "Dante has told me." "Told you what?" she asked, her heart pounding. "About Marco's indiscretions," he said, his voice laced with a hint of shame. "About his alliance with the Rossis." Alessandra felt a surge of anger, of betrayal. "You knew?" she demanded. "You knew all along?" Lorenzo nodded, his head bowed. "I suspected," he admitted. "But I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to face the truth." "And what about Isabella's claim?" Alessandra pressed, her voice rising. "That Marco had help within our family?" "Who, Papa?" "Who was working with him?" Lorenzo hesitated, his gaze shifting away. He looked like a cornered animal, trapped and desperate. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I swear, Alessandra, I don't know." But Alessandra didn't believe him. She saw the fear in his eyes, the guilt, the evasion. He was hiding something, protecting someone. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "You're lying," she said, her voice cold and hard. "You know who it is."
And you're protecting them.
She turned and walked away, leaving her father alone in his library, surrounded by his secrets, his lies, his betrayals. She felt a profound sense of disillusionment, of loss. The foundations of her world, her family, her trust, had been shattered, leaving her adrift in a sea of uncertainty and danger. She could no longer tell truth from lies. She returned to the Moretti villa, more confused, more alone than ever. The protection Dante offered felt like a cage, and the truth, she realized, was far more complicated than she had ever imagined. And more painful. Chapter 10. A Dance with Danger. The revelation that her own family might be involved in Marco's betrayal had shaken Alessandra to her core. She felt adrift, uncertain who to trust, where to turn. Dante, though preoccupied with his investigation, remained her only anchor in this turbulent sea of secrets. He had been keeping her informed of his progress, sharing snippets of information, whispers of evidence. He was closing in on the truth, he said, but he needed more time, more proof. He was cautious, meticulous, unwilling to make a move until he was absolutely certain. One evening, he invited her to join him for a drive. He didn't tell her where they were going, only that it was important. She agreed, trusting his judgment, his instincts. They drove in silence, the city lights blurring past them. The tension in the car was palpable, a reflection of the unspoken anxieties they both felt. Finally, they arrived at a secluded location, a small, unassuming warehouse on the outskirts of Rome. "What is this place?" Alessandra asked, her voice laced with apprehension. "This," Dante said, his voice grim, "is where Marco conducted his secret business. This is where he met with his Rossi contacts." Alessandra felt a chill run down her spine. This was it. The heart of the darkness. The place where her husband had betrayed her, had betrayed his family. Dante led her inside the warehouse. It was dark and dusty, filled with crates and boxes, the air thick with the scent of decay. He switched on a single light bulb, casting a dim, eerie glow over the space.
I found this place a few weeks ago, he said.
Following a lead, a whisper. It took some time to persuade the owner to cooperate. Alessandra could imagine what persuade meant in Dante's world. It likely involved threats, intimidation, perhaps even violence.
She didn't ask. She didn't want to know.
He led her to a small, hidden room at the back of the warehouse. Inside, there was a desk, a chair, a filing cabinet. The room was surprisingly clean, almost untouched. This was Marco's office, Dante said. His sanctuary. Alessandra felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She could almost picture Marco sitting here, plotting, scheming, betraying. Dante opened the filing cabinet, pulling out a folder. I found this hidden in a false bottom, he said. It contains sensitive information. Information that could expose the people involved in Marco's schemes. He handed her the folder. She hesitated, her hand trembling slightly. She was afraid of what she might find, afraid of the truth. But she knew she had to face it.
She had to know.
She opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents. There were names, dates, transactions, all pointing to a conspiracy that reached far deeper than she had ever imagined. And then she saw it, a name that made her blood run cold. Her uncle, Giovanni Romano, her father's younger brother, a man she had always trusted, a man who had been like a second father to her. Giovanni's name was listed repeatedly, linked to various transactions, meetings, communications with the Rossi family. Alessandra gasped, her hand flying to her mouth.
No, she whispered. It can't be.
Dante put a hand on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. I'm sorry, Alessandra, he said softly. I know this is difficult. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears.
Giovanni?
She said, her voice choked with emotion.
But why?
Dante sighed, his gaze turning distant. Giovanni always resented Lorenzo, he said. He felt he was entitled to more, that he deserved to be the head of the family. He saw Marco's alliance with the Rossi family as an opportunity to advance his own ambitions. Alessandra felt a surge of anger, of betrayal, mixed with a profound sadness. She had been so blind, so naive. She had trusted the wrong people, believed the wrong lies. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dante's eyes hardened, his jaw clenching. I'm going to expose them, he said, his voice filled with a cold fury. I'm going to make them pay for what they've done. He looked at her, his gaze softening slightly. But I need your help, Alessandra, he said. I need your support. I need you to be strong. She nodded, her resolve hardening. She would not cower. She would not be a victim. She would stand by Dante, help him uncover the truth, and bring justice to those who had betrayed them. She would dance with danger, if that's what it took. I'm with you, Dante, she said, her voice firm, her eyes meeting his. Whatever it takes. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes. I knew I could count on you, Cara, he said softly. You are a Romano, after all. And Romanos don't back down from a fight. Especially, she silently added, when fighting for what was right, rather than what was easy. It was time to face her family. Chapter 11. The weight of unspoken words. The decision to confront her uncle, Giovanni, weighed heavily on Alessandra. She knew it was the right thing to do, the necessary thing to do, but it was also a betrayal of her family, a violation of the unspoken code of loyalty that had governed her life. She spent the next few days wrestling with her conscience, torn between her duty to Dante, to the truth, and her love for her family, however flawed and fractured it might be. She tried to talk to Dante about her doubts, her fears, but he was preoccupied, focused on gathering the final pieces of evidence, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. We have to do this, Alessandra, he said, his voice firm, his eyes unwavering. We can't let them get away with it. We can't let them continue to undermine us, to threaten our lives. She knew he was right, but it didn't make it any easier. She felt like she was walking a tightrope, balancing precariously between two worlds, two loyalties. One evening, she found herself alone in the villa's gardens. The air was cool and crisp, the scent of jasmine and roses heavy in the night. She sat on a stone bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to find some semblance of peace, some clarity of thought. She heard a sound behind her and turned to see Dante approaching. He sat down beside her, leaving a deliberate space between them, yet his presence still felt comforting, reassuring. "You're troubled," he said, his voice soft, his eyes searching hers. She nodded, unable to speak. The words were caught in her throat, choked by the weight of her emotions. He reached out, his hand gently covering hers. The touch sent a shiver down her spine, a spark of warmth in the cold, lonely night. "Tell me," he said, his voice a low murmur. "What's bothering you?" She hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath, forcing the words out. "It's Giovanni," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know if I can do this, Dante. I don't know if I can betray my own family." He listened patiently, his gaze never leaving hers. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge, didn't offer false reassurances. He simply listened. When she had finished, he was silent for a moment, his hand still covering hers. Then he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "Family is a complicated thing, Alessandra," he said. "It's not always about blood. It's about loyalty, about trust, about shared values. And sometimes, the people we think we know, the people we love, betray us in the most profound ways." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep understanding, a shared pain. "I know this is difficult for you," he said. "But you're not alone. I'm here for you. We'll face this together." His words, his touch, his presence, gave her strength, gave her courage. She realized that he was right. Family wasn't just about blood. It was about something more, something deeper. And sometimes, the greatest act of loyalty was to stand up for what was right, even when it meant betraying those you loved. "Thank you, Dante," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For understanding. For being here." He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Always, Kara," he said softly. "Always." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "We'll confront Giovanni tomorrow," he said. "Together. We'll expose his treachery, and we'll make him pay." His words were a promise, a vow. Alessandra felt a surge of determination, of resolve. She would not falter. She would not back down. She would face her uncle, face her family, and fight for the truth, for justice, for her own future. The weight of unspoken words still lingered, but now, there was a sense of purpose, a sense of shared determination that gave her the strength to move forward. She was no longer alone. She had Dante. And that, she realized, was all that mattered. Chapter 12. A glimmer of hope in the abyss. The next day, Dante and Alessandra drove to the Palazzo Romano, the ancestral home of her family, the place where she had spent her childhood, her adolescence, her early adulthood. It was a place filled with memories, both good and bad, a place that held a special significance in her heart. As they approached the palazzo, Alessandra felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. She was about to confront her uncle, her father's brother, a man she had loved and trusted, a man who had betrayed her in the most profound way. Dante parked the car, and they walked towards the entrance, their steps echoing on the cobblestones. The palazzo loomed before them, a massive, imposing structure, a symbol of power and tradition. They were greeted by a servant, who informed them that Giovanni was in the library. Alessandra felt a sense of déjà vu, a flashback to the day her father had summoned her to that same room, to inform her of her impending marriage to Dante. They entered the library, and Alessandra saw Giovanni standing by the window, his back to them. He turned as they entered, his face a mask of surprise, and was it fear? "Alessandra," he said, his voice slightly strained.
"Dante."
"What a surprise. What brings you here?" Dante stepped forward, his expression grim, his eyes unwavering. "We need to talk to you, Giovanni," he said, his voice cold and hard. "About Marco. About the Rossi family. About your involvement." Giovanni's face paled, his eyes darting nervously between Alessandra and Dante. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. Dante produced the folder, the evidence of Giovanni's treachery. "This," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "This is what I'm talking about. Documents, recordings, witnesses. All pointing to your collaboration with Marco and the Rossi family." Giovanni stared at the folder, his mouth agape, his face ashen. He looked like a cornered animal, trapped and desperate. "It's not true," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's a lie. I would never betray my family." Alessandra stepped forward, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "Don't lie to me, Giovanni," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I saw the evidence. I know the truth." Giovanni looked at her, his eyes pleading, his face contorted with a mixture of guilt and shame. "Alessandra," he whispered, "please. You have to believe me. I trusted you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I loved you."
And you betrayed me.
"You betrayed all of us." Giovanni's shoulders slumped, his defenses crumbling. He looked like a broken man, his spirit crushed. I did it for the family," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought I was doing what was best." "Best for whom, Giovanni?" Dante interjected, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Best for you? Best for your own ambitions?" Giovanni didn't answer. He simply stared at the floor, his body shaking with silent sobs. Lorenzo entered the library, drawn by the commotion. He looked from Giovanni to Dante to Alessandra, his face a mask of confusion and concern. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice filled with authority. Dante stepped forward, holding up the folder. "We have uncovered a traitor in your midst, Lorenzo," he said, his voice cold and hard. "Your brother, Giovanni, has been working with the Rossi family, conspiring against us, betraying your trust." Lorenzo stared at Giovanni, his eyes widening in disbelief, then hardening with anger. "Is this true, Giovanni?" he demanded, his voice trembling with rage. Giovanni didn't answer. He couldn't meet his brother's gaze. His silence was a confession. Lorenzo turned to Dante, his face contorted with fury. "What do you intend to do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dante's eyes were cold, his expression unwavering. "He will be punished," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He will pay for his treachery." Alessandra felt a flicker of pity for her uncle, despite his betrayal. She knew what punished meant in their world. It meant exile, disgrace, perhaps even death. She stepped forward, placing a hand on Dante's arm. "Dante," she said softly, "please. There must be another way." He looked at her, his eyes softening slightly. He seemed to be considering her plea, weighing his options. The glimmer of hope was this internal conflict that had been slowly building. Then he shook his head. "There is no other way, Alessandra," he said, his voice firm. "He has betrayed us. He must face the consequences." He turned back to Giovanni, his expression hardening. "You are banished, Giovanni," he said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "From this family, from this city, from this life. You are no longer a Romano." Giovanni collapsed, his body racked with sobs. Lorenzo turned away, his face buried in his hands. Alessandra felt a tear roll down her cheek. It was over. The truth had been revealed, the traitor exposed, the punishment delivered. But there was no sense of victory, no sense of relief. Only a profound sadness, a sense of loss, a feeling that something precious had been broken, something that could never be repaired. The hope, however, remained, even if only as the smallest flicker, in Dante's moment of hesitation. The change was occurring, and even if Giovanni had to be sacrificed for it, it was coming. Chapter 13. Scars of the Heart Emerge. The aftermath of Giovanni's banishment was a period of quiet turmoil, a time of reflection and reckoning. The Romano family was shaken, fractured, the bonds of trust and loyalty severely strained. Lorenzo retreated into himself, his grief and shame a palpable presence in the palazzo. Alessandra felt a profound sense of loss, a void left by her uncle's betrayal and exile. Dante, though victorious, was not gloating. He understood the gravity of the situation, the pain it had caused Alessandra. He was supportive, understanding, his presence a constant source of comfort and strength. He had shown a flicker of mercy, a hint of compassion, and that gave Alessandra hope, a belief that he was capable of change, of growth. He spent more time with her, sharing his thoughts, his feelings, his own past traumas. He revealed more about his childhood, his difficult relationship with his father, the pressures and expectations that had been placed upon him from a young age. He spoke of the violence he had witnessed, the betrayals he had endured, the scars that had been left on his soul. "I was taught to be ruthless," he said one evening, as they sat together in the villa's gardens. "To be cold, to be calculating, to show no weakness, no emotion." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "But you, Alessandra," he said softly, "you're changing me. You're making me question things, making me feel things I thought I was incapable of feeling." His words, his honesty, touched her deeply. She reached out, her hand gently touching his. "You're not as cold as you pretend to be, Dante," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "There's a warmth inside you, a goodness that you try to hide." He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes.
"Perhaps," he said.
"Perhaps you're right." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "I've never trusted anyone the way I trust you, Alessandra," he murmured. "I've never let anyone see the real me the way I let you see me." His vulnerability, his honesty, was a revelation. It was a breakthrough, a turning point in their relationship. Alessandra felt a growing connection to him, a bond that went beyond duty, beyond obligation, beyond the circumstances of their marriage. She realized that she was falling in love with him. It was a terrifying realization, a dangerous admission. She was falling in love with a man who was capable of great cruelty, a man who lived in a world of violence and betrayal, a man who had once been her enemy. But she couldn't deny her feelings, couldn't ignore the connection she felt with him, the warmth, the understanding, the shared pain. She saw a glimmer of hope in him, a potential for redemption, a possibility of a future that was not defined by the darkness of their past. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, fraught with challenges and obstacles. But she was no longer afraid. She had Dante by her side, and together, she believed, they could overcome anything. They could build a new life, a new future, based on trust, on respect, on love. The scars of the heart were still there, both his and hers, but they were beginning to heal, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope, a belief in the possibility of something more, something better. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Alessandra felt a sense of optimism, a sense of peace, a sense that she was finally where she was meant to be. The pain had to be acknowledged to be overcome, and for the first time, she felt Dante was doing just that. And so was she. Chapter 14. The Enemy at the Gates. Despite the growing intimacy between Alessandra and Dante, the world outside their villa remained a dangerous and volatile place. The Rossi family, though weakened by Marco's death and the exposure of their alliance with Giovanni, were not defeated. They were regrouping, plotting, seeking revenge. Dante was aware of the threat, constantly vigilant, taking precautions to protect himself and Alessandra. He increased security at the villa, assigned bodyguards to accompany her whenever she left the house, and kept her informed of any developments, any whispers of danger. "They won't give up easily," he said one evening as they sat together in the library. "The Rossis are like wounded animals, cornered and desperate. They'll lash out, strike back." Alessandra nodded, her heart filled with a familiar apprehension. She knew the dangers of their world, the constant threat of violence, the precariousness of their existence. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dante looked at her, his eyes filled with a determination, a resolve that both reassured and frightened her. "We fight back," he said, his voice firm. "We show them that we're not afraid, that we won't be intimidated. We protect ourselves, and we protect each other." His words, his confidence gave her strength. She knew he would do everything in his power to keep her safe, to protect her from harm. But she also knew that there were no guarantees in their world, no assurances of safety. A few days later, their fears were realized. Alessandra was returning to the villa from a shopping trip, accompanied by her bodyguards, when their car was ambushed. Gunfire erupted, shattering the windows, sending bullets whizzing past them. Alessandra screamed, ducking down in her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. The bodyguards returned fire, engaging in a fierce shootout with the attackers. The car swerved, screeching to a halt, the tires blown out. Alessandra was terrified, paralyzed with fear. She had never been so close to death, so exposed to the violence that permeated their world. She closed her eyes, praying for it to be over, praying for Dante to save her. The gunfire stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Alessandra slowly opened her eyes, her body trembling. She saw one of her bodyguards slumped over the steering wheel, blood staining his shirt. The other bodyguard was lying on the ground, wounded but alive. The attackers were gone, vanished into the city streets. They had struck quickly, brutally, leaving behind a scene of chaos and destruction. Alessandra was shaken, bruised, but miraculously unharmed. She was pulled from the car by the surviving bodyguard, who quickly called for reinforcements. Dante arrived within minutes, his face a mask of fury and concern. He rushed to Alessandra, holding her close, his hands trembling. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Did they hurt you?" She shook her head, her body still trembling. "I'm fine," she whispered.
"But one of the bodyguards, he's dead."
Dante's jaw clenched, his eyes hardening with rage. "The Rossis," he said, his voice filled with a cold fury. "They'll pay for this. They'll pay for every drop of blood they've spilled." He held her tighter, his embrace a mixture of protection and possessiveness. "I won't let them hurt you, Alessandra," he vowed. "I swear it. I'll protect you with my life." His words, his promise, were a comfort, a reassurance. But Alessandra knew that the danger was far from over. The enemy was at the gates, and the battle had just begun. She looked into his eyes, knowing this was just one skirmish in a long war. And it was one that now directly targeted her. Chapter 15. A test of loyalty and love. The attack on Alessandra solidified Dante's resolve to eliminate the Rossi threat once and for all. He intensified his efforts, working tirelessly to gather intelligence, to identify the key players, to plan his counterattack. He was like a general preparing for war, his focus absolute, his determination unwavering. He also became even more protective of Alessandra, restricting her movements, increasing her security, keeping her close to him at all times. He was taking no chances, unwilling to risk her safety again. Alessandra understood his concerns, his fears, but she also felt suffocated, trapped by his protectiveness. She missed her freedom, her independence, her ability to move about the city without fear. She tried to talk to him about it, to express her frustration, but he was unyielding. "It's too dangerous, Alessandra," he said, his voice firm, his eyes unwavering. "I can't risk losing you."
"Not now."
"Not ever." She knew he was right, but it didn't make it any easier. She felt like a prisoner in her own home, a gilded cage, albeit a luxurious one. One evening, she decided to take a walk in the villa's gardens, seeking a moment of solitude, a breath of fresh air. She was accompanied by 2 bodyguards, their presence a constant reminder of the danger that surrounded her. As she walked, she noticed a figure lurking in the shadows, a man she didn't recognize. He was watching her, his eyes intense, his expression unreadable. She felt a surge of fear, a premonition that something was wrong. She turned to the bodyguards, alerting them to the stranger's presence. Before they could react, the man stepped forward, pulling out a gun. "Don't move," he said, his voice cold and menacing, "or she dies." Alessandra froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She recognized the man now. He was one of the Rossi family's enforcers, a ruthless killer known for his brutality. The bodyguards hesitated, unsure what to do. They were outnumbered, outgunned. They couldn't risk a shootout, not with Alessandra's life at stake. The enforcer grabbed Alessandra, pulling her close, pressing the gun against her temple. "Tell Dante Moretti," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "Tell him we have his wife. Tell him if he wants to see her alive again, he has to meet us. Alone." Alessandra felt a wave of terror wash over her. She was a pawn in their game, a hostage, a bargaining chip. Her life was in danger, and Dante's was too. The bodyguards relayed the message to Dante, their voices urgent, their faces grim. Dante's reaction was immediate, visceral. He flew into a rage, smashing furniture, cursing the Rossis, vowing revenge. But then, he calmed himself, his mind focusing, his resolve hardening. He knew he had to act quickly, decisively. He couldn't risk Alessandra's life. He agreed to meet the Rossis alone, unarmed. He would do whatever it took to save her, even if it meant sacrificing himself. He looked at his trusted lieutenant, Marco, a different Marco than Alessandra's late husband, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and resignation. "If I don't come back," he said, his voice low and steady, "you know what to do." Marco nodded, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a silent understanding. Dante turned to leave, his steps purposeful, his body tense. He was walking into a trap, a potential death sentence. But he had no choice. He had to save Alessandra, the woman he loved, the woman who had changed his life. Alessandra, meanwhile, was held captive in a dark, dingy room, her hands tied, her heart pounding with fear. She didn't know what was happening, what Dante was planning, whether she would ever see him again. This was a test not just of their circumstances, but of everything they had been building. It was a test of her loyalty, of his love, of whether all the changes could withstand the ultimate threat. The outcome was uncertain, the danger very real. Chapter 16. Reckoning with the Past. Dante arrived at the designated meeting place, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the same location where he had found the evidence of Marco's betrayal. It was a fitting setting for this final confrontation, a place steeped in the shadows of the past. He was alone, unarmed, as agreed. He walked into the warehouse, his senses on high alert, his eyes scanning the darkness. He knew he was walking into a trap, but he had no choice. He had to save Alessandra. He saw them then, the Rossi family leaders, standing in a circle, their faces illuminated by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. They were surrounded by their enforcers, armed and menacing. And there, in the center of the circle, was Alessandra. She was tied to a chair, her face pale and bruised, but her eyes defiant. She looked at him, her gaze filled with a mixture of fear and love. "Dante," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. He took a step towards her, but one of the Rossi leaders stopped him, raising a hand. "Not so fast, Moretti," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We have some unfinished business." Dante stood his ground, his expression unwavering. "Let her go," he said, his voice cold and hard. "This is between us." The Rossi leader laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "Oh, it's between us, all right," he said. "But she's part of the equation now. She's your weakness, Moretti, and we're going to exploit it." He signaled to one of his enforcers, who stepped forward, pressing a knife against Alessandra's throat. "One wrong move," Moretti the leader said, "and she dies." Dante's jaw clenched, his fists balled into tight knots. He was trapped, outnumbered, outmaneuvered. But he wouldn't give up. He wouldn't let them hurt Alessandra. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm, to think strategically. He had to find a way out of this, a way to save Alessandra and himself. He looked at the Rossi leader, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating intensity. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. The Rossi leader smiled, a slow, chilling smile. "We want what's ours," he said. "We want our territory back. We want our power back. We want revenge." He paused, his gaze shifting to Alessandra. "And we want to see you suffer, Moretti," he added. "Just like we suffered. Just like Marco suffered." Dante's eyes flickered with a flicker of pain, a reminder of the past, of the betrayal that had started this whole bloody feud. He knew that the Rossis were motivated by more than just greed or power. They were driven by a deep-seated hatred, a thirst for vengeance. Marco was a traitor, Dante said, his voice low and steady. He betrayed his family. He betrayed his own blood. He deserved what he got. The Rossi leader laughed again, a harsh, bitter sound. You're a hypocrite, Moretti, he said. You're no different from Marco. You're both ruthless, both driven by ambition, both willing to do anything to get what you want. Dante didn't answer. He knew there was some truth in the Rossi leader's words. He had been ruthless. He had been ambitious. He had done things he wasn't proud of.
But he had changed.
Alessandra had changed him. She had shown him a different way, a different path. She had taught him the meaning of love, of loyalty, of trust. He looked at Alessandra, his eyes filled with a deep, unwavering love. Let her go, he said again, his voice softer now, filled with a plea. Please. She's innocent. She has nothing to do with this. The Rossi leader hesitated for a moment, his gaze shifting between Dante and Alessandra. He seemed to be considering Dante's plea, weighing his options. Then he shook his head.
No, Moretti, he said, his voice hardening.
It's too late. The price of your sins must be paid. And she will be the payment. Before Dante could react, before he could even move, the enforcer plunged the knife towards Alessandra. It was at this precise moment that Dante's training took over, and with a swift, decisive action, disarmed the man closest to him, using the weapon to strike down two others. The room erupted. Chapter 17. Flames of passion and peril. The warehouse exploded into chaos. Dante, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate need to protect Alessandra, fought with a ferocity he hadn't unleashed in years. He moved like a whirlwind, disarming and disabling opponents, his every action precise and deadly. He was a one-man army, driven by love and rage. Alessandra, despite her terror, watched in awe and admiration. She had never seen this side of Dante, this raw, untamed power. It was both frightening and exhilarating. She saw the man he had been, the man he was trying to leave behind, and the man he was becoming, all intertwined in this desperate struggle. The Rossi enforcers, though numerous, were no match for Dante's skill and determination. He fought his way towards Alessandra, clearing a path through the melee, his eyes fixed on her, his focus absolute. He reached her, quickly cutting her bonds, pulling her close, shielding her with his body. Are you all right? He asked, his voice hoarse with exertion, his eyes searching hers. She nodded, her body trembling, her eyes filled with tears. Yes, she whispered. But you're hurt. He had sustained a cut on his arm, blood staining his shirt. He dismissed it with a wave of his hand. It's nothing, he said. We need to get out of here. He grabbed her hand, pulling her towards the exit, fighting his way through the remaining Rossi enforcers. They were almost there, almost free, when the Rossi leader, his face contorted with fury and desperation, blocked their path. He raised a gun, pointing it at Dante. It's over, Moretti, he snarled. You're not going anywhere. Dante pushed Alessandra behind him, shielding her with his body. He stood his ground, his eyes locked with the Rossi leaders, his expression unwavering. It's over for you, Dante said, his voice cold and hard. You've lost. It's time to end this. The Rossi leader hesitated for a moment, his finger tightening on the trigger. He seemed to be weighing his options, calculating his chances. Then a shot rang out. The Rossi leader crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide with surprise, his body lifeless. Dante and Alessandra turned to see Marco, Dante's lieutenant, standing at the entrance of the warehouse, a smoking gun in his hand. He had arrived with reinforcements, a small army of Moretti men, their faces grim, their weapons drawn. The remaining Rossi enforcers, seeing their leader dead, their forces outnumbered, surrendered, dropping their weapons, their faces filled with fear and resignation. It was over. The battle had been won. The Rossi threat had been eliminated, once and for all. Dante turned to Alessandra, pulling her into his arms, holding her tight. It's over, Cara, he whispered, his voice filled with relief and exhaustion. It's finally over. She clung to him, her body shaking with sobs, tears streaming down her face. She was safe, he was safe, they were alive. The warehouse, once a scene of chaos and violence, was now filled with a strange, eerie silence. The flames of peril had been extinguished, replaced by the flickering embers of passion and relief. As the police arrived, sirens wailing in the distance, Dante led Alessandra out of the warehouse, into the cool night air. He held her close, his arm around her waist, his presence a source of comfort and strength. They'd stepped into a battle zone, and now they emerged, changed, but together. They had faced death, faced their enemies, faced their past, and they had emerged victorious. But the victory was bittersweet, tinged with the pain of loss, the scars of battle, the knowledge that their world would never be the same. He looked down at her, the fire reflecting, finally, not in a raging inferno, but in a controlled burn. They had a lot to talk about, but they had a lifetime, however dangerous, to do it. Chapter 18. The Unraveling of Secrets. In the days following the warehouse confrontation, the city of Rome seemed to hold its breath, the echoes of the violence reverberating through the underworld. The Rossi family was decimated, their power shattered, their leadership extinguished. Dante, though wounded, had emerged as the undisputed victor, his authority solidified, his reputation enhanced. But for Dante and Alessandra, the victory was a quiet one, a personal triumph overshadowed by the lingering trauma of the battle, the weight of the secrets that had been revealed, the knowledge of the lives that had been lost. They retreated to the villa, seeking solace in each other's company, trying to heal, to recover, to make sense of the chaos that had engulfed their lives. Dante's physical wounds were healing, but the emotional scars, both his and Alessandra's, ran deeper, requiring time, understanding, and a willingness to confront the past. One evening, as they sat together on the terrace, overlooking the city lights, Alessandra decided to broach a subject that had been weighing on her mind. "Dante," she said, her voice soft, her eyes searching his. "There's something I need to ask you. Something about Marco." Dante tensed, his jaw clenching, his gaze turning distant. He knew what she was referring to, the unspoken questions that lingered between them, the shadows of the past that still haunted their present. "What about Marco?" he asked, his voice guarded, his eyes avoiding hers. "The Rossis, they said he suffered," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "What did they mean, Dante? What happened to him?" Dante sighed, his shoulders slumping, his expression filled with a mixture of pain and resignation. He knew he couldn't avoid this conversation any longer, couldn't keep the truth from her. "It's not a pretty story, Alessandra," he said, his voice low and strained. "It's brutal." She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I need to know, Dante," she said. "I need to know the truth, no matter how painful." He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to reveal. "After I discovered Marco's betrayal," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I confronted him. I gave him a chance to explain, to confess. But he denied everything. He lied to me, to my face." Dante's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white, his body trembling with the memory. "I lost control, Alessandra," he continued, his voice choked with emotion. I hurt him. I tortured him. I wanted him to suffer, to pay for what he had done." Alessandra felt a chill run down her spine, her heart aching for both Dante and the memory of her late husband, however flawed he might have been. She had known that Marco's death had not been natural, but she had never imagined the brutality of it, the darkness of Dante's actions. "And then?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dante's eyes filled with tears, a rare display of vulnerability. "I didn't kill him, Alessandra," he said, his voice pleading. "I swear to you, I didn't. I left him there, broken, defeated. But I didn't kill him." He looked at her, his gaze searching hers, seeking forgiveness, understanding. "The Rossis, they found him," he continued. "They finished the job. They made it look like a heart attack, a natural death. They used it to manipulate you, to control you, to draw you into their web." Alessandra felt a wave of nausea wash over her, the truth hitting her with the force of a physical blow. She had been a pawn in their game, a tool of revenge, a victim of their machinations. She reached out, her hand gently touching Dante's. "I believe you," she said, her voice soft, her eyes filled with compassion. "I know you didn't kill him. I know you're not a monster." He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude, with relief, with a love that transcended the darkness of their past. He had carried this burden, this secret, for years, and now, finally, he had unburdened himself, shared the truth with the woman he loved. The unraveling of secrets had been painful, brutal, but it was also necessary, a cleansing of the wounds that had festered for so long. It was a step towards healing, towards forgiveness, towards a future free from the shadows of the past. They had faced the darkness together, and they had emerged, scarred but stronger, their bond deepened by the shared trauma, the shared truth. The path ahead remained uncertain, but they would walk it together. Chapter 19. A choice between duty and desire. With the Rossi threat neutralized and the truth about Marco's death revealed, a semblance of peace settled over the Moretti household. However, the intricacies of mafia life, with its ever-shifting alliances and obligations, soon presented a new challenge, a new dilemma for Dante and Alessandra. Word reached Dante that the heads of several other prominent families, concerned by the power vacuum created by the Rossi's demise, were seeking a meeting. They wanted to discuss the future, to re-establish the balance of power, to ensure stability in the underworld. Dante knew that this meeting was crucial, a delicate dance of diplomacy and intimidation. He had to assert his dominance, solidify his position, and protect his interests. But he also knew that it could be dangerous, a potential trap, a chance for his rivals to undermine him. He discussed the situation with Alessandra, seeking her counsel, her perspective. He valued her judgment, her intuition, her ability to see through the facades, to understand the hidden agendas. "They're wary of you, Dante," Alessandra said, her voice thoughtful, her eyes focused. "They see you as a threat, a rising power. They want to contain you, control you." Dante nodded, his jaw clenching.
"I know," he said.
"They want to force me into an alliance, a partnership that will benefit them, not me." "And what will you do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a conflict, a struggle between duty and desire. "I have a responsibility," he said, his voice strained. "To my family, to my men, to our business. I have to protect our interests, ensure our survival." But then, his gaze softened, his expression changing, revealing a vulnerability, a longing for something more. "But I want a different life, Alessandra," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A life with you. A life free from the violence, the betrayals, the constant threat." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. "I want a life of peace, of happiness, of love," he said. "A life where we can be together, without fear, without secrets, without the shadows of the past." Alessandra's heart ached for him, for the burden he carried, for the conflict that raged within him. She knew the weight of his responsibilities, the pressures of his world, but she also saw the yearning in his eyes, the desire for a different future. "What are your options?" she asked, her hand covering his. "I could agree to their alliance," he said, his voice laced with a hint of distaste. "Join forces with them, share power, maintain the status quo. It would be the safe choice, the expected choice." "And the other option?" she pressed, her voice filled with a hopeful anticipation. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze searching hers. "I could refuse," he said, his voice firming with resolve. "I could walk away. I could leave this world behind, start a new life, with you." His words were a revelation, a declaration of his love, his commitment to her. He was willing to give up everything, his power, his position, his family legacy, for her, for their future. Alessandra felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of joy, of fear, of love. She knew the risks involved, the dangers of turning his back on his world, but she also saw the sincerity in his eyes, the depth of his feelings. She looked at him, her heart overflowing with love. "And what do you want, Dante?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Not what is expected of you. What do you desire? He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes. I want you, Alessandra, he said, his voice filled with a profound tenderness. I want a life with you. That's all I want. The choice was clear. Duty versus desire. The past versus the future. The darkness versus the light. And Dante, the ruthless mafia boss, the man who had lived by the sword, had chosen love. He had chosen her. It was a defining moment and a turning point, representing not just a strategic move, but the final step of a deep-seated personal transformation. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. Dante's decision to refuse the alliance with the other families sent shockwaves through the Roman underworld. It was an unprecedented move, a defiance of tradition, a rejection of the established order. It was a declaration of independence, a statement that he would no longer be bound by the rules of their world. The other family heads were furious, insulted, threatened by Dante's audacity. They saw it as an act of war, a challenge to their authority. They vowed to retaliate, to punish him for his insubordination, to force him back into line. Dante knew that he had made enemies, that he had put himself and Alessandra in a precarious position. But he was prepared. He had anticipated their reaction, and he had taken steps to protect himself, to ensure their safety. He gathered his most trusted men, his loyal lieutenants, and informed them of his decision. He told them that he was leaving the Famiglia, that he was starting a new life, a life free from violence and betrayal. Some of them were shocked, dismayed, even angry. They had dedicated their lives to the family, to the code, to the traditions. They couldn't understand Dante's decision, his willingness to abandon everything they had fought for. But others, like Marco, his loyal lieutenant, understood. They saw the change in Dante, the transformation that Alessandra had wrought. They saw his desire for peace, for happiness, for a different future, and they respected it. We're with you, Dante, Marco said, his voice firm, his eyes unwavering. Whatever you decide, we'll follow you wherever you go. Dante was grateful for their loyalty, their support. He knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed them, their strength, their expertise, to navigate the treacherous waters ahead. He also reached out to allies, to contacts he had cultivated over the years, people who were not directly involved in the mafia, but who had influence, connections, resources. He sought their help, their protection, their guidance. He was building a new network, a new alliance, based not on fear or intimidation, but on trust, on respect, on shared values. It was a risky strategy, a gamble, but he was confident that it would succeed. The final confrontation came, as expected, at a meeting called by the other family heads. They summoned Dante to their headquarters, a grand palazzo in the heart of Rome, a place steeped in history and tradition. Dante knew it was a trap, a potential ambush. But he had no choice. He had to face them, to make his position clear, to show them that he was not afraid. He arrived at the palazzo, accompanied by Marco and a small contingent of his most trusted men. They were heavily armed, prepared for anything. The meeting took place in a large, ornate room, filled with the heads of the other families, their faces grim, their eyes hostile. They were surrounded by their bodyguards, their enforcers, a silent, menacing presence. Dante stood before them, his expression unwavering, his posture confident. He looked them in the eye one by one, letting them see his resolve, his determination. I have made my decision, he said, his voice clear and strong, echoing in the silent room. I am leaving the Famiglia. I am starting a new life. I will not be joining your alliance. His words were met with a stunned silence, followed by an uproar of anger, of outrage, of disbelief. You dare defy us, Moretti? One of the family heads shouted, his face red with fury. You dare turn your back on your family, on your obligations? I have no obligations to you, Dante retorted, his voice cold and hard. My only obligation is to myself, to my wife, to our future. You will pay for this insubordination, Moretti, another family head snarled. You will regret this decision. I am not afraid of you, Dante said, his voice unwavering. I am prepared for whatever you throw at me. The tension in the room was palpable, a powder keg waiting to explode. It seemed that violence was inevitable, that a bloody battle was about to erupt. But then, Alessandra stepped forward. She had been standing silently in the background, observing the proceedings, her heart pounding with fear and apprehension. But she could no longer remain silent. She had to speak, to defend Dante, to fight for their future. Stop this, she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the noise and the anger. This violence, this hatred, this endless cycle of revenge, it has to end. She looked at the family heads, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. Dante is offering you a chance, she said. A chance to break free from the past, to build a new future, a future based on peace, on cooperation, on respect. He is not a traitor, she continued, her voice rising with passion. He is a visionary. He is a man who is brave enough to choose love over hate, peace over war, a future over the past. Her words, her courage, her conviction, stunned them into silence. They had never seen a woman speak like this, with such authority, such passion, such defiance. They looked at her, at Dante, at the two of them together, and they saw something they had never seen before, a love that transcended the boundaries of their world, a bond that was stronger than any family tie, any code of honor, any tradition. It was a moment of transformation, a turning point. The final confrontation was not a battle of guns and violence, but a clash of hearts and loyalties. And in that clash, love had triumphed. It had been a long road of mafia ties, arranged marriages, and betrayals. But it had ended in a choice: love, freedom, and a completely unknown future.
Epilogue.
The years that followed were not without their challenges. Dante and Alessandra faced ostracism from some quarters of their former world, threats from lingering enemies, and the constant adjustments of building a life outside the rigid structures of the famiglia. But they faced it all together, their love a shield against the storms, their shared vision a guiding light. They left Rome, settling in a secluded villa in Tuscany, surrounded by rolling hills, vineyards, and the quiet beauty of the Italian countryside. They created a sanctuary, a place of peace and tranquility, far from the shadows of their past. Dante used his skills and resources to establish a legitimate business, investing in vineyards, olive groves, and tourism. He became a respected member of the community, known for his generosity, his integrity, and his commitment to ethical practices. He had reinvented himself, not as a mafia boss, but as a businessman, a philanthropist, a man of peace. Alessandra, too, found a new purpose. She became involved in local charities, supporting education, the arts, and environmental protection. She rediscovered her passion for music, playing the piano for local events, sharing her gift with the community. She blossomed in this new environment, her spirit free, her heart filled with joy. They had no children of their own, but they welcomed many into their home, hosting family gatherings, mentoring young people, and offering support to those in need. Their villa became a haven, a place of warmth and laughter, a testament to the power of love and redemption. Dante never completely escaped the specter of his past. There were occasional threats, reminders of old enemies, moments of fear and uncertainty. But he faced them with courage and resolve, always protecting Alessandra, always prioritizing their safety and their happiness. One crisp autumn evening, as they sat together on their terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange, pink, and gold, Alessandra turned to Dante, her eyes filled with a love that had only deepened with time. "Do you ever regret it, Dante?" she asked, her voice soft, her hand resting gently on his. "Leaving that world behind? Giving up your power, your position?" He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes, a smile that spoke of contentment, of peace, of a love that had conquered all. "Never, Cara," he said, his voice filled with a profound tenderness. "I have everything I ever wanted right here. I have you." He leaned in, kissing her softly, a kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that spoke of a love that had endured, a love that had triumphed over adversity, a love that had defied the odds. They had built a new legacy, not of violence and fear, but of love and hope. They had transformed their lives, turning away from the darkness and embracing the light. They had found their happily ever after, not in the gilded cage of the mafia world, but in the simple, profound beauty of a life lived together, in peace, in love, in freedom. Their choice, made amidst a storm of bullets and betrayals, proved to be the right one. And they were both finally free. The end.